As Ukraine approaches the 3-year mark of Russia's invasion, the stakes have never been higher. Leaders were hoping that the Munich Security Conference would give some signal to the country's future. So, did Ukraine get the support it needs, or are cracks forming in the West's resolve? I'm Andrij Dobriansky, and today's Newsmaker is Ukraine's future. During the U.S. presidential campaign, Donald Trump had repeatedly said that he could settle the war between Russia and Ukraine in just one day if he's elected president again. Well, Trump has been in the White House for almost a month now, and from the looks of it, Ukraine's biggest supporter till now has a new plan. Some would say it's exclusive to some degree and perhaps even divisive. A series of declarations that made a big splash over at the Munich Security Conference is pointing that the U.S. and Russia could be moving closer to getting a deal to end the war in Ukraine, whether or not Europe or Ukraine like it.
We want the war to come to a close. We want the killing to stop.
A diplomatic tug of war on the Russia-Ukraine conflict is gathering pace. Over the weekend, the Munich Security Conference saw a showdown between the great Western powers. Ahead of a meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the US Vice President J.D. Vance attacked Europe over free speech and democracy.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
While European leaders were scrambling to find an answer to Vance's comments, US President Donald Trump's Ukraine envoy raised the stakes.
Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes, of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table.
Now, Europe is trying to find a united response to Trump. On Monday, some EU leaders, the NATO Secretary General and the British Prime Minister met in Paris to discuss Ukraine and increasing defense spending.
We are facing a new situation after living for decades in a form of carelessness regarding our own security, which we in some way implicitly outsourced. And when I say we, it's a collective European we, which was implicitly outsourced to our American partners.
All these developments have come after Trump had a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin last week. Trump described the lengthy talks as highly productive and said negotiations to end the war will start immediately. Negotiations were set to begin on Tuesday as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio flew to Saudi Arabia to meet with the Russian delegation. Yet in Munich, Zelensky said Ukraine would not accept any deal negotiated behind their back.
No decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine, no decisions about Europe without Europe. Europe must have a seat at the table when decisions about Europe are being made.
And Rubio has already made a U-turn.
It will reach a point when if it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well.
So, no breakthrough is expected in Saudi-led talks to end the nearly 3 years of fighting. Russia still wants Ukraine to cede some of its territory, while Ukraine rejects any prospect of losing its territorial integrity and wants security guarantees. And the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said these Ukrainian demands were unrealistic objectives. Now Europe and Kiev are alarmed as the US begins negotiations without a common plan. So the main questions are, can Trump make peace with Putin? And would his approach be best for a Europe that's suffering the deadliest war on its soil in 70 years?
Joining me now to debate are from New York, the Director of Communications for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Andrij Dobriansky. From Moscow, lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, Viktor Olevich. And from Alexandria in Virginia, adjunct professor over at Johns Hopkins University and former U.S. diplomat in Moscow, Donald Jensen. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. It's great to have you on the show. Andrij, let me begin with you. So here's what happened in Munich over the weekend. You have Vice President J.D. Vance spending a good portion of his opening speech criticizing European democracies. President Zelensky talking about the possible creation or his desire for the creation of a European army. And when you analyze it, that did not go down well at all. And then you have Special Envoy Kellogg dropping the proverbial bombshell, saying essentially there's no place for Europe at the negotiation table. What is Ukraine's future looking like?
Ukraine is going forward with whatever it needs to do to secure its future. So that means a multi-vector diplomatic attack, if you will. It is still very much involved with the new U.S. administration, always looking for inroads into getting people over there. Unfortunately, it's just starting at the Keith Kellogg level. But let's be serious here. Anybody who's talking about Ukraine really needs to visit Ukraine. It would be great if the vice president or even the secretary of defense actually visited Ukraine before talking about it publicly like he has. So in that respect, they are still working on it. They are working on that rare earth mineral treaty and want to get even more inroads into this new administration, which is just getting its feet on the ground. As far as Europe, it's definitely going to have to be the lead diplomatic and military voice for Europe for the future. It's the country that's the most combat experience as far as what Russia has done. And with all these other countries seriously worried, seriously fearing about what Russia would do were the allies of Ukraine to give it up. I think the natural counter to that is not just helping Ukraine, but letting Ukraine demonstrate to the rest of the European continent how it can flourish without being dependent on Russian monies, how it can flourish by banning interference in its elections by Russia, and how the rest of the world will really flourish if we finally take this moment to defeat that regime.
Viktor Olevich, let me turn to you. You think it's fair to say that Russia is very pleased with what happened in Moscow, and maybe sort of add to one of the points that Andrij was making in terms of Russia perceiving the exclusion of European stakeholders from these decisions as a sort of maybe a tacit exception of what Russia wants?
Well, Russia feels that the Europeans themselves are responsible for their exclusion at this point. The only reason that talks have started at all is that the American side, the new American administration in Washington, has decided to unblock diplomatic relations and unblock relations between the leadership in Moscow and Washington to seek comprehensive talks on ending the crisis in Ukraine. Nothing prevented European leaders from talking to Moscow themselves or from initiating contact. In fact, when several leaders of European and EU countries visited Moscow, be it the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, or the head of Hungary, Viktor Orban, they were severely criticized by EU leadership. So nothing and nobody prevented Macron or Starmer or Scholz or other leaders from initiating comprehensive negotiations with Moscow before Trump did it. And they can even do it now. They can pick up the phone and call and see where that goes. There hasn't been any instance when Moscow squarely refused to speak or to negotiate with European counterparts, whether it's on the issue of the Ukrainian crisis or on other issues of global importance. It's also important to note that in a number of instances, when serious international crises were resolved, it was done without involving each and every party that could or had been interested. During the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, negotiations were held directly between Moscow and Washington, between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And the fact that Fidel Castro and the Cuban government wasn't particularly happy about Soviet missiles departing Cuba, that didn't really play a large role. The Soviet Union was able to provide another viable and effective way of providing security guarantees for Havana and stationed a limited military contingent there. 10 years later, when Nixon and Kissinger decided to compromise with Beijing and restore diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, they didn't really involve Taiwan much in the negotiations. It would be quite unlikely that Taiwan would agree to relinquishing its seat on the UN Security Council and giving it to Beijing if it was asked. And we see that those two diplomatic crises were resolved successfully without involving every side. But that being said, at some point, of course, the Europeans are going to be involved, and it's up to them when they will want to join serious, comprehensive negotiations.
Yeah, and we're actually seeing the European leaders sort of scrambling to sort of hedge themselves. Donald Jensen, let me turn to you. Keeping in mind to what Victor said in terms of the historical references, how do you think the current administration in Washington, Donald Trump, is going to be addressing this resulting diplomatic tensions with the allies across the Atlantic? Or the question is, does it even really care when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, I can't speak to the administration's motivations. I think that we should focus on what's going to happen going forward. And as the Russians say, put the dvizhuka aside and look at the actual facts as they're taking place. Certainly the U.S. administration wants a settlement in Ukraine. There's no sign they're going to abandon Ukraine, but clearly also the U.S. administration wants to have the Europeans play a leading role. Sort themselves out in Paris, beginning in Paris today. They will sort themselves out when the U.S. delegation meets the Russians in Saudi Arabia later this week. I think we should not get ahead of ourselves and expect a quick resolution to all of this new environment. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a child, but that's not really applicable here. There are issues such as Russian war crimes, the Russian kidnapping of children, sanctions, Russia's invasion of Ukraine to begin with, and that's not just a crisis, that's an illegal invasion of Ukraine. So all of these things have to be sorted out, and it will be sorted out over the coming weeks and months if it works at all. And I direct you to Secretary Rubio's comments yesterday when he said exactly that. This is just the first step in a process that could go awry in any directions in the coming weeks and months. So let's see what happens in Paris. Let's see what happens in Saudi Arabia. Let's see if real progress can be made toward halting this cruel, horrible war.
Andrij, you're agreeing to the Victor's or Donald's assessment that the historical references to the Cuban Missile Crisis is not fair, that it's not as simplistic as that.
Well, I'm not saying that it's not fair. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis for the very purpose that it's not a nuclear conflict. And if there's only one party who would make it a nuclear conflict, if that party, if the aggressor party, the one that's committing genocide, were to include nuclear arms, then it would be a serious breach of the NPT, and that would bring sanctions even further against it. But my further nodding was actually about what Europe is doing in regards to the justice part of it. You can't just have a ceasefire. You can't just have a discussion about where lines of demarcation will be. This conflict does not get resolved or finalized without the issues that Donald brought up. And chief among them are the war crimes, are the crime of breaking the peace. And that is why President Putin is an internationally wanted war criminal. And it is why Europe is taking the lead now. It's not just waiting for the United States to do things. Now that the United States is interested in speaking to Russian diplomats, I don't exactly know what level they are that they are sending to Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't sound like it's the foreign minister going to Saudi Arabia. But as far as what Europe is doing, Ursula von der Leyen very clearly laid out that that Europe is interested in backing an international tribunal and going forward in terms of having some kind of resolution as far as justice for the people who lost their entire homes. 12 cities of over 100,000 people, over 20,000 children, as Donald Jensen, have been stolen and reprogrammed back in Russia, as well as the numerous other crimes that have been documented by humanitarian aid group after humanitarian aid group.
Victor, let me bring you, I want you to respond to what Andrij was saying. I mean, not only to the accusations of war crimes and the International Tribunal, but also the ceasefire and the demarcation lines. I mean, what is Russia's primary objective going to be here?
Look, moral issues are very peripheral to the realist foreign policy mindset. And that mindset right now governs both in Moscow and in Washington. The Chinese government was accused of many crimes in the late 1940s and 1950s. There were issues, they were accused of occupying Tibet, and they were accused of crimes against their own people and crimes and other issues of apparent moral significance to their adversaries. But none of that played any part in Nixon and Kissinger making a deal with Mao that reconfigured the international geopolitical space. And the reason for that was that it was convenient and it was beneficial from the point of view of Washington to have China as a partner against the Soviet Union. And at this point, the Trump administration believes that it is beneficial to American interests to end the 3-year-old bloody war in Ukraine. Russia also wants negotiations on ending the war. That doesn't mean that both sides have already decided on everything and have reached a deal. No. If such a deal could be reached, that's still a big if. But what looks like a breakthrough is that, unlike the previous administration, the new administration in Washington realizes that in order to end this conflict, it has to talk directly to the Russian leadership. What Washington realizes today, what the American administration realizes today, is that the idea of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia in the Ukraine war is impossible. That's not going to happen. So their approach has changed, and Russia is satisfied that that approach has changed. That doesn't mean that negotiations are going to be easy. It's obvious that they're going to be difficult. These are going to be tough negotiations, probably over a protracted period of time. There are going to be various surprises from various sides in this conflict, and we are going to see how they go. But it is better to hold negotiations. It is better to have at least some semblance of to seeing some light at the end of the tunnel than not seeing any light at all. And that is where we are right now.
Donald, I want you to sort of respond to what Victor was saying. You know, he's saying that it's better to hold negotiations. Talk to me about, you know, I know you said you can't speak on behalf of this current U.S. administration, but looking at your experience in the region, what do you think the strategic interests are of the United States, and sort of balancing that with the commitments it has had to Ukraine's sovereignty?
Well, first of all, just make a point here, which is that, unlike what Victor said, this is not about realist politics. This is the whole crisis was precipitated because the Ukrainian people had Western-oriented democratic values and resisted a brutal Russian invasion to impose them. So it's not like U.S. and China during Kissinger. This is about values fundamentally. Just make that one point. A second point I would make is that we have to be careful not to see negotiations as an end in themselves. Russia sees negotiations very differently than the West does. For Russia, and you could quote many Russian commentators, negotiations are a way to advance Russia's strategic interest. They win, the West loses. This is not the way the Harvard School looks at negotiations. And so the behavior has been clear for 50 years how they do this. They harangue, they lie, they cheat, they claim control over Donbass and when they don't even have full control over Donbass. So this is in many ways just a variant of hybrid warfare, and that's why we are all in the West entering it with a very sober approach.
Viktor, I want you to respond to that.
Well, every world power has its own information line. If you want to call it lying and cheating, if you look at what the United States did in the Second Iraq War, lying about weapons of mass destruction being used as a pretense to start a war against Iraq, and then admitting that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So would you call it lying, cheating, or Western values? The truth of the matter is, if you leave propaganda, whether it's Russian, Western, Japanese, Chinese, every country has its own information line, its own propaganda. If you step away from that, you would see that every country defends and promotes its interests during negotiations. That's the entire purpose of diplomacy, using non-lethal, non-military tactics to gain leverage or bring benefit to their own country. That doesn't mean that that gaining some benefit from negotiations brings the other side brings detriment to the other side. No, the point of negotiations is having both sides compromise in such a way as both would get some benefit from those negotiations. The Trump administration is a tough negotiator. Russia has seen that during the first Trump term. Russia has no illusions about these negotiations being easy, nor does the Trump administration. As I said, these are going to be tough, difficult negotiations that will involve, if they are going to be successful, they're going to involve difficult compromises. But those are going to be compromises that both sides are going to have to be able to live with for years to come. Because this war that has taken too many lives, it has to end. And both sides want that to happen. So bringing up issues of moral significance or talking about war crimes or other issues, the only result of that is going to be a prolonging of this conflict that will bring more deaths on both sides.
Okay.
We have to be realistic about that.
All right, thank you. Andrij, let me turn to you. I mean, if every country is going to defend and promote its own interests, as Viktor said, and some of the compromises that need to be made, what is Ukraine's primary objective now, looking at where all the cards have fallen?
The same one that it's always been. Ukraine is, as Donald mentioned, a country with certain values. It is a country of dignity, and it wants to uphold that, and its people will hold its leadership accountable to that. Now, I don't know what this concept is of having a war without a finality reached at the end where justice is served. We're not talking about morality here. We're talking about justice. This is about international law. This is about native law to each country. And if you don't resolve that, if you don't include any kind of justice for those who have been harmed, you're going to have in Russia an experience for the next 50 years of people being killed left and right. And the Russian leadership will never know when the next assassination will be happening. What they need to do for their own selves is establish a way of incorporating justice for the Ukrainian people, lest they be eliminated in a more gangster-type fashion. So this is for the benefit of all parties. I like the fact that Viktor finally escalated the crisis in Ukraine, as he mentioned at the beginning, to a war in Ukraine. But in fact, this is an invasion of Ukraine. And it has escalated to the fact that the Russian Federation has now been invaded and occupied for the first time since it became the Russian Federation in the 90s. It is, in fact, struggling under nearly 10% inflation. It is losing thousands of people on a daily basis just to occupy small villages in Ukraine. I think for the rest of the world has seen what Russia is, and frankly, it is only by giving them a lifeline and attempting to listen to them, in contrast with the strategy in Europe has been, which is isolate the criminal actors, until they are ready to come to the table honestly. And until we see that, I think Europe, the European Union for sure, and other leaders, including President Zelensky, are doing the right thing by demonstrating that the only way you counter something like that is standing together strong. And hopefully Europe remembers that lesson.
Andrij, thank you very much. Victor, I have about 30 seconds left. I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, look, if these negotiations do not succeed for one or the other reason, Russia can always continue its military operation in Ukraine. And the truth of the matter is that Ukraine is losing ground every day, and it's losing a lot of people. And that's not sustainable. If Ukraine would like that to continue, of course it can do that. But what Russia's hope is, and the hope of a lot of people in Ukraine is that both sides come to the negotiating table and end this conflict as soon as possible with the least possible deaths.
Okay. Viktor Olevich, thank you very much. Andrij Dobriansky, and to you as well, Donald Jensen, thank you for joining us here on this edition of The Newsmaker. Thanks for watching. You can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Adjunct, and we'll see you next time.